Please close your eyes for a moment. I want you to think. Think of the person that knows you best. Is it your mother who brought you into this world and nurtured you into the person that you are today? Is it that friend who's been there for you both in good times and in bad? Is it your romantic partner with whom you've shared so many intimate experiences? Or is it a piece of code sitting on a server somewhere, analyzing all the data that you've created over the last 10 years? I'm concerned. I'm concerned that the wealth of information that we share will expose us to a new set of risks. A new set of risks to our privacy, our security, and our well-being. Competition law and privacy law are evolving here in Europe to address these risks, and my fellow speakers and panelists have addressed this already. So what I want to offer you instead is a different perspective. By the way, you may open your eyes. Sorry. So what I want to offer you today instead is a different perspective. I want to offer you the perspective of the individual. You see, in the face of these risks, we as individuals are the first line of defense. Yet many of us tell ourselves three myths. Three myths that provide us with a false sense of security. And tonight, I'm going to uncover these three myths. Myth number 1. I have nothing to hide. Do you really have nothing to hide? Not even your browsing history? I see some of you smiling. But for the rest of you, let's examine your relationship with technology instead. You're probably using your phone to swipe, to browse, to search, to shop, so on and so forth. In each of these interactions, you are sharing your state of mind. And on the receiving end of your generosity is an algorithm. An algorithm that is meticulously studying the state of mind. It is learning what to show you to keep you engaged. You see, in your brain, there's a circuit of neurons called the reward pathway. It's the one that controls your motivations, your emotions, and your fears. When dopamine interacts with a group of cells in this reward pathway, it gives you the sensation of pleasure. Nature's way of motivating you to do things that are beneficial for you, such as eating food, working out, so on and so forth, is by activating this reward pathway in anticipation of the pleasures that come with these activities. The platforms that we use and the algorithms that underlie them deliberately exploit your reward pathway to keep you engaged. Instagram, for instance, will withhold your likes to create a dopamine-driven feedback loop. And as these platforms have become ever more sophisticated at using your data to create these dopamine-driven feedback loops, you in turn have granted them a greater share of your life. In 2011, we spent 46 minutes a day on our phone. In 2018, you spent 4 hours. But there's no reason to worry, after all. You have nothing to hide. I'm afraid that this line of reasoning underestimates the risks. It assumes that the only way that your data can be used to cause you harm is by exposing something that you have to hide. Sadly, there's so much more that one can do with your data to harm you. I encourage you to be more protective with your data rather than believing that you have nothing to hide. But now that we've uncovered this first myth, let's move on to our second myth. The danger is so far away. How far away is far? Already I've shared with you how these platforms are using your data to create dopamine-driven feedback loops. You've heard that as you've spent more time on these platforms, you've been exposed to entities that seek to advance subversive agendas. and you've witnessed firsthand as the world has unfortunately become more polarized. Our capabilities in artificial intelligence are advancing rapidly. We're no longer just limited to using artificial intelligence to predict. Now we can use artificial intelligence to create. Two classes of models that have achieved astonishing success are transformers and generative adversarial networks. Given data, these models have been able to compose music, to create art, and to even draw photorealistic images of human beings. None of these people ever existed. They were created by AI. In the next 2 years, a malicious actor with access to your information can leverage these techniques to create an impersonation of you, a digital version of you that looks like you, sounds like you, and behaves like you. There are many ways in which your data can be used to exploit you, ways that are currently available and ways that will be available in the near future. I encourage you to realize that the threat is imminent. But now that we've uncovered the first myth, that I have nothing to hide, and the second myth, that the danger is so far into the future, let's talk about our final myth. Why me? With 8 billion other people in this world, why would someone want to impersonate me? The answer is simple. It's because you're special. You're very special in the eyes of your mother, which is why if she were to receive a text message from you, she's most likely going to respond. And if this text message sounded exactly like you and had an image of you, would she even doubt for a moment whether or not it is you? A malicious actor can use your data to deceive the people that you care about, to get them to click in a malicious link that grants him or her access to their data, their information, and their private health information, for instance. An attack like this would be very complex to execute today, given where we are with artificial intelligence. But that will change in the next 2 years, specifically as advances in generation become more possible, to the point where such an attack can be coordinated across millions of people by just one individual. You may be protected in your anonymity currently, but this protection will erode in the future as we advance in artificial intelligence. So let's take a moment to recap all that we've learned. We've learned that we have become incredibly dependent on technology and the platforms that we use. They have added a lot of value in many facets of our lives. In return, we have given them our data, our time, and our lives. And we've justified this exchange by telling ourselves that we have nothing to hide. We've convinced ourselves that the danger is so far into the future. And we've also assumed that if that danger were to come to be, we would be protected in our anonymity. With these 3 myths, we have provided ourselves a false sense of security. A false sense of security that underestimates the timeline and scale of the dangers to come. Therefore, I'd like to encourage you to rethink these myths and to handle your data with better care. Thank you.
If we rethink now, what do you suggest that we do?
So there are several steps that you can do rather than, becoming a cave person and using a Nokia instead. I think one suggestion that I would have for you is to opt out of services like Axiom. So Axiom essentially takes in your offline behaviors and links them with your online behaviors. So companies like Facebook, Google, so on and so forth, can actually see what you're purchasing offline. So delinking that link is one step that you can take to protect your data, for instance.
Okay, how can a law help us? What do okay, we all can be more careful, but how can law,
I think that competition law has been very effective, or at least the dialogue that we're having related to competition law has been very effective in terms of how can we limit the scope and influence that many of these companies have. How can we, let's say, limit them from sharing data between their services? How can we get them to disperse their data so that we can have more competition that allows for more secure services? But I think that law is really targeted towards helping us and protecting us against companies that can be held accountable. I think the real risk lies with entities that can't be held accountable, so malicious actors. And I think that's where our Achilles heel lies at the moment as well.
Okay, Herr Professor Potsdam, what do you think? Can we have a micro, please?
Well, I think that's impressive. I hope you're not overestimating the power of competition law, but I think this sort of discussion is a sort of, we are at a turning point of making the discussion work. I just sort of wonder how we can sort of deal with the dangers that you described rightly, how we can sort of introduce that more effectively into, say, our kids or our young people's minds, etc. I mean, we are one thing. The next generation. I'm not even using Instagram. Yes, but how would you deal with that? Do you have the feeling that we need to be more interventions there?
Yes, I think that there definitely is a need for greater awareness. I feel that at this stage we're not fully aware of where our data is. There's a lot of services that have our data and a lot of services that have our information, but many people aren't fully aware of it. And I think that education very early on in terms of how to handle your data, how to protect your data, what companies use your data and how they can actually use it to exploit you in one way or another would be critical to instill at an early age.
You know, here, Professor Konrad, here comes Mika.
When we moved into apartments, people started entering into the apartment and stealing stuff. So we invented locks, okay, and the security industry. So if this becomes a real threat for people, I mean a frequent threat, a threat that virtually affects everybody, there should be huge space for industry that generates locks. I mean, not physical locks, but locks that protect us from exactly the things you mentioned. Isn't this the solution of the problem? I mean, why should I mean, I'm a very optimistic person, but I think the market will solve it, isn't it?
Yes, and you already see there are services.
An economist who talks, the market will solve it. Last year we spoke about capitalism. That's the result.
So I think there will always be a push or pull. You know, there'll be attackers may be creative and create a new type of loophole, and then the market will respond to that. So I think that we can expect the market to resolve some of these risks in that regard. For instance, having services that log your data, protect your data, let you know who's using your data. But at the same time, there always will be loopholes as well. And I think having a keener awareness of those loopholes to begin with is critical.
Okay. Herr Rabe und dann Frau Karl und dann kommen wir wieder vor.
David, this sounds as if this doesn't seem to be a problem of individuals living in the Western world, but rather a global problem. What, from your point of view, would be appropriate legal or institutional level to deal with this challenge besides the individual? I mean, would it be large economic blocks? Would it be an international organization? Because it feels if across the globe individuals will get affected by such a threat or such an attack, that this could also create some kind of international solidarity in order to overcome this challenge.
That's a very good question. I'd say that there definitely is a need for a multinational approach, for a body like the United Nations to create an organization that essentially helps companies be better stewards of data and make sure that the data is being handled appropriately across different geographies. I think there's a need for that. We already see primitives of that. For instance, the United Nations and the let's say CTBTO is like a nuclear watchdog that essentially makes sure that no country tests nuclear weapons. And I think an equivalent approach will be needed in that respect as well.
Okay, Frau Karl.
David, when I listen to presentations like yours, I always realize, that there's a real skill gap from your generation and what you know than to our generation and what we know. And coming from a talent management point of view, what are your ideas on upskilling, the rest of the world, because I think we really encounter two different worlds in terms of data literacy, in order to be able to even discuss, on eye level with you?
Well, I'd say that that's a good point. I think that one thing I've seen in the last 5 years is that people have become a lot more aware of their data. So the presentation which I gave today and the myths that I've mentioned, I've been talking about them for quite some time. And I remember 5 years ago, my friends would be like, so what? I don't really care too much. I have nothing to hide. But I think that people are becoming increasingly aware. Sure, there is still a gap. There's still a data literacy gap. There's still a gap in terms of really what are the future threats to come. And I think that, in some way, if there's a body that educates people on those future threats, if the media also takes it on and conveys it perhaps in a medium which people can appreciate better, if it's something which is taught at universities and at colleges and at primary schools as well, then I think that gap can be reduced somewhat.
Julie?
Thanks, David, for making these important points. When I think about these problems, which I do all the time working in my area, as you know, I work with Internet of Things and artificial intelligence and cryptocurrencies and blockchain and the intersection of all of these things. That's a massive amount of data. Mm-hmm. It's immutable data. It's data that's forever there. It's data that could potentially be hacked with quantum methods that may come along sooner or later, we don't know. But I've seen this in the evolution of my own kids, because being who I am, I've been quite conscientious about making them use secure things for their data. And my son was complaining to me about how I make him use a VPN and how I make him do all this other stuff that other parents' kids don't have to do. And the reality is, at the end of the day, we do have technologies like self-sovereign identity and other things being developed that can help us with that. But there's a trade-off between protecting my privacy and being cognizant of it and just sheer convenience. And at the end of the day, we have limited bandwidth to think about decisions that we have to make. And while we can build technologies and entire companies like Ocean and things that are being built to handle data marketplaces and data control, data access, that means we have a lot of decisions to make. Mm-hmm. How do we reduce the complexity of this decision making so that I don't have to click yes, this, no, that, yes, this, no, that all day, because otherwise my 4 hours on my phone will go up to 24.
Exactly, and sometimes one needs a quick answer and doesn't have time to read everything.
That's certainly true. First of all, I'm going to say I don't have a direct answer to that. I'd say from my personal experience, whenever I come back to Europe, whenever I visit a website, the first thing that comes up is like cookies. Do you accept cookies? Do you not accept cookies? You don't see that in America. And of course, because of the convenience of using these platforms, the thing that I automatically do is just like click accept. And so I think that we're right now in a position where these platforms that we're using provide us so much value to the point where we overlook the threats. So it'll be very hard to turn down, let's say, Amazon, or to turn down Uber, or any of those applications that we use. So I'd say that I don't really have a direct answer in terms of how we can reduce the complexity and make people see it at the same level in terms of the benefits and the threats. But I do think that, as we move into the future and we see more threats come to be, for instance, let's say the WhatsApp hack, people become increasingly more aware of how their data can be, manipulated or used or taken from them. And maybe that might be a factor that reduces the complexity of those decisions.
Okay. Sophie, and then Bruce.
Marie-Sophie Held, a Green Parliamentary Group in the German Parliament here. Actually, my question is very much linked to what you just said, because a lot of people say we need those free data flows, we need the big concentration of data in some platforms because it creates innovation. Mm-hmm. What would you answer to this question? And I have a second question, because you mentioned that competition authorities actually address the issue of data concentration. For example, now the Bundeskartellamt did a decision on Facebook. Mm-hmm. But I think the purpose was not to protect threats from malevolent actors, yes. But it was really about data protection. And do you think that concentration of data should be looked at by competition authorities also under this aspect?
So there are two approaches. I think that certainly the concentration of data should be looked at by competition authorities, especially if the person who's holding that data cannot really be held accountable or is not necessarily meeting our requirements of trust. And we've seen some of that happen. I think the proposals that are in place in terms of how can we limit the concentration of data, how can we share the data across different companies, for instance, to start up competition, I think those approaches are quite premature. One approach that has been mentioned by authorities, I think it was mentioned by some folks in the United Kingdom, is how can we, for instance, let Google have or share their data with other platforms and have those platforms be able to use Google's data in order to create an equivalent to Google that is more privacy, that is not ad-based. But I think when you think about the implementation of a project like that, you realize that it's very difficult to de-anonymize Google's data. For instance, if I were to see 2 searches that you've made, I'll be able to use that to identify you. So I think it's very tricky to look at it from a competition perspective, and it's very tricky to try to limit the data that companies have and to distribute it. And I think that might, eventually cause a bigger privacy risk than just continuing with it.
Yeah, David, but we have here experts for this question. Herr Karl, do you think that could you answer the question from your point of view?
No. That's another tricky question. We have seen, again, the Federal Cartel Office moving in with a Facebook decision, doing basically an unbundling decision for the scrambled data and basically asking the companies not to, or keeping it more separate as before. I think we are at that point where we understand all those risks and we are moving forward to address it in a way. And Mr. Potsdam mentioned it, we have those open notions in the legal framework, in the German and the European antitrust code, where we can try to understand it. And therefore, I think we will see more of those deconcentration or splitting up decisions under the market dominant test. However, I would argue this is not only a law enforcement issue, because sometimes those open areas probably are distortion of innovation. We just don't see it. It's more that what was mentioned in the discussion, yes, let's try it and then we look at it. So my argument would be, let's be innovative in rulemaking and don't be shy to make amendments to it. Don't be so stubborn to use it 10 years, 15 years and then do a rehearsal. I think we learned a lot in the discussion that agility is probably the way to best tackle and not to overreact, not to regulate too detailed and not to see any risk. And therefore, this is not an answer to the question, but I think it's adding to the mindset we need to have, that we are not frightened, but we need to see the risk and then start the way to get the hand on from a legal point. Then I think we have added to security, added to education, and empowered innovation probably.
Yes. Yeah, 1 second, Bruce. Sorry, Bruce. We need micro. It doesn't work.
Hello. Oh, it works. It's more, I have 2 observations. We need 2 major mind shift changes, and this is globally, not just in Europe. The first one is that data, if it's not with the owner, has to be a liability. There has to be a high enough penalty or a risk of holding that private data for companies to give it back up. And I think that GDPR is the first step in that direction. And I think Europe is the leader in moving us in this direction. So that's first observation. If you can make data, having private data, a liability, you start to push it back into the ownership of the people who should have it. The second point kind of goes towards Dr. Conrad's point of we all have locks on our apartments because that's where our stuff is. On the internet, our stuff is everywhere. So how do you pull that stuff back, or at least have transparency where your stuff is? And that's where some technologies are coming up through blockchain, through cryptocurrency, through all these things where actually you can start taking back control over your assets, whether they're data or other assets, and putting a lock on it, but in a virtual sense. And so this is another mind shift change that people can start to understand, that they can actually own their data again, where we have completely lost control. So those are just the 2 points that I made.
Okay. Thank you, Bruce. Now Helmut Meyer.
Dankeschön. I want to open the discussion on a broader spectrum. I think you asked a question about trust. In a society, you have a value called "Who Can I Trust?" There's a famous book written by Rachel Botsman about that subject. And trust in a digital society is moving. It's moving away from government institution to algorithm. And the question is, for me, how do we deal with it? Is the bigger danger the government, the control and the surveillance by states, or by companies who are governed by competitive laws, competition laws? I personally think there are still societies, villages, areas where you don't lock your door because you have trust in your neighbors. And the question in the future society is, where do we find that level of trust?
Okay, I think, ja. Können wir das Mikro mal weitergeben an Nico Rabe? It's a very complex statement. Yeah, I think.
Thank you for allowing me a second question. David, in your capacity as a global citizen who literally is at home in 3 continents, I would have a question on what, once again, what can Europe do in this sense? Because what we see in, for instance, Russia and China, that they at least say that they need to protect their countries by localizing the internet, being able to cut off their national internet in a situation of any kind of attack, that kind of attacks, also institutional attacks by other states. Do we need a European internet as a consequence?
I think that one beneficial position that Europe is in is the fact that it's a large market. And so it's a large market for many companies. I think many tech companies make over 30% of their revenue from Europe. So while Europe might not necessarily be the hub of innovation just yet, they still have this ability to actually form regulation that can steer these companies in the right direction. And so I'd say Europe's task really is to do exactly that. And they're already going about doing that. So how can Europe necessarily frame regulation in such a way that is an inspiration for the rest of the world to follow? And many of the speakers today spoke about that early on. In terms of creating a European internet, I think that that goes against European values of openness and freedom of information. And so I would posit that perhaps that's not the strategy to go. I don't think that isolation will necessarily solve the issue. And at least that's my take. I'm not sure if there's anything you'd like to add to that as well.
No, yeah.
Yes. So I hope that answers that question.
Yeah. There's one more question, then we finish. Here's the micro.
Birgit Hansen, just a fan of Mrs. Flick, friend and a fan of Convoco. I worked in the media before. One idea came up in my head just now that I thought, as long as data means money, data will be sold. If data doesn't mean money, then maybe it's controllable.
Yes, it's very hard because data does not always mean money. They can have a lot of data about something, but you can't really use that data for something that makes sense. But for instance, if you're in a position like Google where you're trying to personalize ads and be highly targeted, then the more data you have, the more accurate you are, the more targeted you can be, and the more money you make.
But there's too much money in selling data.
Look, yeah, but okay. But as we learned before, you're right. But as we learned before, somebody who has a bad idea and wants to manipulate maybe your personal life that's not about money. That's about power. I would leave it now here because it gets now very complex and more difficult. What I think is interesting, what you say, we personal, there are three sides. It's the personal awareness that we should say, hello, this is our data and it might go wrong. Then there is the responsibilities of the companies, of the platforms, where the trust comes in. Who do we trust? Can we trust? And the third part is the law part, where we say, where must our commissions come in, the Monopoly Commission, our data protection, our system that we can trust. So these three fields, I think, have to come together.
Yes.
And I think we should leave it here for today. I thank all of you, all participants, because I think we all learned a lot. It's a big field, but I think it's also an exciting field. And we should much more think about it, because our times are dangerous times, but for me personal, are exciting times. I think my daughter, who's here present today, will ask me one day, were you aware of what was going on? And I think this is something we should put more in our field, that we see it. And we all sind jetzt aufgerufen, darüber nachzudenken, wo unsere Reise hingehen soll. Und zwar nicht nur mit unseren Daten, sondern auch mit Europa. So, danke.